So one thing we can do is we have the code now on our local. We've cloned the repo, and we can start to explore a little bit in terms of how this Docker container was created. There is a template in this particular example. We have config files. There's also a Python file that contains the code. We can start to examine the index.html uses labels for the title and for the buttons. Then those labels are pulled in from a config file. And like I said, there's also Python code if we were to care to investigate that. Okay. So fairly simple application, only less than 100 lines of code essentially. Okay. Now, next thing we want to do is to go into the well, let's bring the container down first. So the opposite of Docker compose up is Docker compose down. So we'll stop this application from running on a local. We basically were able to compile it and prove that it works running on our local. Now what we'll want to do is we'll want to go into the Azure portal here. And we're going to go into the create a resource, and we're going to create a container registry. Now if we go under the containers category, we'll see container registry listed as a featured resource. Now the container registry is basically a location where you can store your images. So when you've developed your code, you've tested it locally, your containers are all working, you can Docker compose up them, everything's great. You can push that container into a container registry so other people can grab it. It's very similar to how GitHub is your code registry or your code repository. The container registry is a place for containers. It's also very similar to Docker Hub. The fully qualified domain name is .azurecr.io. So I can give it a very generic name, AZSJD. This is going to be my container registry. I do need to place it in a resource group. That resource group needs to, that container registry needs to live somewhere. Probably a good idea that the container registry lives close to where you are for performance reasons, and which SKU that we want. Let's look at the different SKUs for Azure Container Registry. So there are 3 SKUs, Basic, Standard, and Premium. You can see that the price per day runs from 16 cents per day, which, if we do the math, runs about $5 a month, all the way up to $1.60 per day, which probably runs around $50 a month. You get a limitation on storage, limitation on the number of webhooks that you can call into the container registry, and whether or not your container images are geo-replicated, which means stored in other locations of the world. In this particular case, because we're just testing this, 10 gigabytes is still plenty, and we don't necessarily need a 5x increase in the price of the container registry. So I'm going to choose the basic SKU, and we're going to click Create. So our container registry was successfully created. We see that we have our 10 gigabyte quota with nothing being used. Our login server, we're going to have to know this for later, so I'm going to keep a copy of that. At the current time, we don't have anything loaded into this ACR. It's completely empty. And so let's push our first application. We're going to go back to the Docker terminal here. So before we do that, let's look at the images that exist already within our Docker. So if I run the Docker images command, I can see that there are 6 images that are in our Docker image repository locally. 2 of them don't have names. The Azure Vote Front is the image that we were just playing with in terms of the voting app. The Nginx application is a web server. Hello World we played with before, and the Redis is the back end. Okay, so the front end and the back end are there in terms of our images here. Okay. So we do have Docker images. Now, we do need to tag our Docker image with the name of our container registry login server here. So that the Docker tag command, and remember what we're looking to push is Azure Vote Front. We do need to use our server name, and we're going to call it Azure Vote Front within Azure Container Registry as well, and it's a v1. So after the colon is going to be where we're tagging versions essentially. So now our Docker image is tagged with, now instead of being tagged latest, it's got this name of Azure Vote Front v1. Okay, and the previous version is there as well. Now we need to push this to our login server. So it's docker push is the command for that. And we're going to push it to azsjd Azure CR IO. And remember, the image that we want is the Azure Vote Front v1. We can watch it as it pushes code up to ACR. It took a little while, a few minutes to upload, but we can now see that our Docker image should be sitting in our repository. And if we go back up to the portal and hit refresh, now Azure Vote Front repository is sitting in Azure. So we've essentially pushed the container to this repository. We can actually see, since we've tagged it as a v1, that the v1 version of this is now sitting in our Azure code repository. Now hopefully you can see where this is going, right? So we started off this section by pulling code from a repository, happened to be a Docker Hub, and deploying that into a container, a Kubernetes service container. And then we looped back, got the code. We could have potentially modified the code, compiled it, tested it on our local, pushed that into a container repository, registry here. And so now we can basically store our own private repositories in the Azure Container Registry, and then use that into things like Azure Kubernetes Service to get applications up and running.